Okay, this video covers objectives number 6 and 7 about erroneous conscience and culpably erroneous conscience. All right, first I want to just talk about what is an erroneous conscience. Sometimes our conscience is in error. Basically what that means is that something that we think is good is not good, or something that we think is not harmful actually is harmful. So when our conscience is in error, we are at great risk of causing harm without meaning to cause harm. Now, sometimes our conscience can be in error and it's really not our fault. All right, we have a mistaken conscience, an erroneous conscience. So our conscience believes that something will not cause harm that actually will cause harm. All right. An erroneous conscience is an honest belief. You honestly believe that something is okay to do that's not okay to do, or vice versa. You can't see the problems with your conscience. So there are 6 things that the Catechism lists that can lead to an erroneous conscience. And I want to make sure that I go over those with you. All right, these are all from Catechism number 1792. All right, so the 6 sources of erroneous judgment of conscience are, number 1, ignorance. And that's simply when you are unaware that your actions might be causing harm. So your conscience is in error. You're doing something, but you're not aware that it is causing harm. For example, if a 2-year-old takes a candy bar from the store, they're most likely operating out of ignorance, which is that they don't realize that stealing candy from the store is wrong. So they have an ignorant conscience. In this case, the Catechism isn't using the term ignorance as a negative term. In our culture, ignorance has a negative connotation. But in the Catechism, ignorance just simply means that you are unaware that what you're doing is causing harm. Another thing that can cause your conscience to be in error, the second thing, is the bad example of others. Now, this is simply watching adults or peers or other people around you in your culture that behave in a particular way and thinking that that behavior is normal when actually that behavior causes harm. So that would be an example of the bad example of others. The third source of erroneous judgment of conscience is being a slave to our repetitive nature. Being a slave to your repetitive nature is like being a slave to your passions. It just simply means that you are not in control of your emotional behavior. So, for example, if someone has a really bad temper and because they have a bad temper, every time they get angry, they lash out at others and they're really mean, but they don't realize there's something wrong with that because they erroneously believe that acting on their passion is not sinful, then they would have an erroneous conscience that is a slave to its appetitive nature. All right, the fourth one is mistaken notion of freedom of conscience. And this is basically when a person believes that if they don't see something wrong with a particular situation, then there's nothing wrong with it, and they don't have an obligation to find out if there might be something wrong with it. So they mistakenly believe that whatever they feel is right is okay, and whatever they don't feel is right is not okay, without understanding the importance of forming as well as following one's conscience. The fifth one is rejection of the church's authority and the church's authority to teach. This doesn't necessarily mean someone who rejects the church outright. It just simply means that because they are not Catholic, because they don't respect the church, or because they don't know about the church, they haven't heard the church's teaching, so they haven't had an opportunity to learn what the church teaches. And even if they had the opportunity, they may not take that opportunity because they don't understand that what the church's authority is, and that the church has 2,000 years of collective wisdom that can help them see what things might cause harm and what things are safe to do. So that would be rejection of the church's authority and its right to teach. The final one, the sixth erroneous judgment of conscience comes from, or the sixth source of an erroneous judgment of conscience comes from what the Catechism calls lack of conversion or lack of charity. Basically what that means is that if we are a basically selfish person, or we don't love others, we only love ourselves, that is going to lead us to have erroneous judgments of conscience, because The conscience presupposes a love and a care for other people and a desire not to hurt them. But if people are very selfish, they would have a hard time loving others, and therefore they would often make erroneous judgments of conscience. So those are the 6 sources of erroneous judgment of conscience: ignorance, bad example of others, slave to appetitive nature, mistaken notion of the freedom of conscience, rejection of the church's authority and its right to teach, and a lack of conversion or lack of love. All right, sometimes our conscience is in error and it's really not our fault. Sometimes our conscience is in error and it actually is our fault. When our conscience is in error and it is our fault, we have what's called a culpably erroneous conscience. Culpably erroneous conscience is basically a very fun Catholic word that means your conscience is in error, but really your conscience is in error and it's your own fault. It can be your own fault for 2 reasons. Either number 1, you had the opportunity at some point in your life to learn that this particular behavior would cause harm, but since you didn't want to know that it would cause harm because that might cause you to have to change your behavior, you didn't find out. So you had the opportunity to form your conscience correctly, and you did not take that opportunity. The second thing that can cause you to have a culpably erroneous conscience, or a conscience that's your own darn fault, is if you have committed a sin so many times that you no longer see it as wrong. And so through the habit of sin, you have blinded yourself to the severity of that particular sin. All right, and we all know times in our lives when we've committed the same sin over and over again, and perhaps the first time we did it, we felt really guilty about it, but after we do it long enough, we kind of numb our conscience to the severity of that particular sin. In that case, we would have a culpably erroneous conscience. So we wouldn't see our sin as a big deal, but the only reason we wouldn't see it as a big deal is because we've committed it so many times that we've created a habit of sin, and we no longer see the truth about that sin. All right. Finally, in the Catechism, in Catechism 1778, there's a quote by John Henry Cardinal Newman that calls the conscience the aboriginal vicar of Christ. And what that simply means, if we believe that our conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, aboriginal means original or indigenous. So an indigenous people would be called the aboriginal people. So when we call the conscience the aboriginal vicar of Christ, we mean that it is the original or indigenous voice of Christ in each of our lives. So each person is born with a soul, with a spirit, or the voice of Christ inside of them that urges them to do good and urges them to avoid evil.